Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Killam with the Wycliffe Global Alliance, and we're going to talk today with a friend of mine, Scott Strazzante. Scott is a photographer with the San Francisco Chronicle, and in our past work lives, we have crossed paths at a couple of suburban Chicago papers over the years, and have not known each other well, but our work has crossed paths. And Scott is extremely credentialed. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's won National Newspaper Photography a year before. His work has been in newspapers and National Geographic, Sports Illustrated, lots of other publications. So we're very happy to have you with us, Scott. Thanks for taking time to do this.
Anytime, Jim. Good to see your face.
Yeah, you too. You have shot Super Bowls, you've shot the Olympics. I mean, you've done all the dream assignments, yet I'm really intrigued that I've heard you say many times that your heart is really for the small story and for, kind of the very local, personal stuff, the universal stories, I guess, but on a very small level. Could you talk about that a little?
Yeah, it's over my 30-year career in newspapers, I've always gravitated towards the everyday. Like most of us, and I do this at times, you walk down the street and you're in your own world. You're maybe listening to something on your headphones, or you're just kind of thinking some thought about something that's coming up. And we just walk by so many interesting things in the world and we just never notice them. And the same thing kind of happens in kind of daily assignments where a lot of times I will get, kind of open-ended assignments to photograph a person because they did something of interest, and I'll be sent to their home, and maybe I'll call them beforehand and I'll be like, well, what are you doing today? And they'll be like, nothing, and then I'll get to their house and there'll be something extraordinary going on. Like, maybe they're giving their daughter a haircut in the backyard, or, they got a new puppy and they're, teaching it to do something, and people just think that their lives are boring no matter how interesting they are. And so I've always throughout my career tried to kind of focus on all those little moments that we all experience in everyday life and kind of show them back to other people. And then they kind of realize, well, I guess my life isn't mundane. I actually have all these little joys and triumphs and celebrations, that go on all the time. And I just kind of ignore them.
I was going to ask you that. Do you kind of open their eyes to those mundane experiences being a lot more than that when they see the photos? It sounds like yes.
Yeah, for sure. It's like when you, photograph people, it just kind of gives them a level of importance. And I think, when they actually see how other people see them, sometimes it actually makes them feel a little bit better about themselves. And that's what I do. I've always been the type of photographer that at the end of a story, I want to wrap a nice red bow around it. I want it to be uplifting. I want my work to be a celebration of life. I do have to cover sad events or funerals or the homeless, but I still always try to find, some sort of, uplifting moment within it. One of my favorite photographers is a guy named Gregory Crutzen, and he does these very elaborate, staged, cinematic scenes that he photographs over days. And but I heard him speak once, and he said that his favorite moments are at the intersection of beauty and sadness. And there was something about that really struck with me. And, it seems to me that their everyday life has this mixture of beauty and sadness. And when you can kind of photo that, when you're in a sad situation, there, for some reason, there always is some sort of beauty or something life affirming in it. And that's what I try to do.
Nice. A lot of the people who are going to be watching this, would be in international situations, places that most of their audience would never ever see, and yet it still feels kind of mundane. So it feels like it's almost like that, if you drive to work, take a different route every day or something.
Right,
so you
right.
just things differently, huh?
Yeah. Although the weird thing though is when I do my street photography, I tend to always take the same route, which is really interesting. It's like I'm such a creature of habit, but then I notice on the same route just the minor changes that happen on a day-to-day basis. And something that is different really pops out. And so I don't know if that's a philosophy for people to change, because I do like your philosophy better, but it is interesting. Like I am a creature of habit, and it really is hard to get me out of my routine. But within that routine, I always try to find, something that's interesting and different.
How do you train yourself to do that, Scott? Because we're talking to a lot of people that don't shoot photos for a living. So how do you kind of get in that mindset of just, it's like me as a reporter, I kind of think of life as a series of story ideas. Do you do the same with photos as you're just walking around? Does it just kind of develop in you?
Yeah, I've always, I think, been an observer. When I was a child, my family, we would hop in the old country squire station wagon every summer, and it would be my two sisters, my parents, and my mom's parents, and the seven of us would every summer take 2 or 3 weeks off and just drive around the country. And I would just sit there and just stare out the window at the world going by. And I think that just kind of trained me to have this visual acuity for some reason, because I never really thought of being a photographer. It just kind of came to me in college. But just kind of looking at things, and then once I became interested in photography, looking at other people's photography, but also looking at my photography and just kind of studying it and just seeing how my eye moves and within a frame. Because if you look at photography and you really take a look at a photo, your eye will go to the brightest thing first. So you can kind of maybe train yourself when you photograph something to lead the viewer's eye around your image. And so just take a photograph and look at it really quickly and just study, where does my eye go first, where does it go second, where does it go third, where does it go fourth, and usually it'll keep coming back to the same place, and that place it comes back to should be your highest point of interest in the image. And it's something that you almost have to kind of train yourself to do. And some people, I guess, maybe have it instinctually for some reason. I've always tended to be able to compose photos in an interesting way, whether I'm looking through the camera or not looking through the camera, because my street photography is done in a style called shooting from the hip, where when I walk down the street, I hold my iPhone a little bit above waist level, and I kind of walk by a scene, and I just kind of hit the shutter as I move through. And I've been able to learn to control it over the years, just by practice, because I think it originated back when I would be photographing a lot of children, and they tended to want to just stare right up at the camera. And so I would tend to just put the camera lower so they would look at my face, and then at least the photos I was taking didn't have that camera awareness. So it just, for me, is just been years of looking at photographs and looking at my own photography. So I think to help your own photography, if you're going to a place, find other photographers who've been there first and study their work and see what they've found, and don't copy what they do, but be inspired by it. And I think there is a little bit of training that you have to do, and but the best training is to just go out and make photographs and learn by your mistakes, because I think that's pretty much how my career evolved.
Yeah, I was picturing you going around like the Hollywood director where they do the box, and do you do that, or do you just kind of?
Well, that is so interesting, because when I was in college and I had no interest in photography, I saw a gallery show of a Chicago Tribune photographer my junior year in college. I was at a place called Ripon College in Ripon, Wisconsin. And when I saw Paul Giroux's work, I immediately said, this is what I want to do for a living. I had an interest in photography, but not photojournalism. So at that point, I was a business major, and my college offered no photo classes. So I decided to become an art major also. And one of my art teachers, Olympia Ogilvy, we would spend days walking around Ripon, Wisconsin, looking through a slide holder, a little, rectangle shape, just kind of composing the scenes as we saw them. And, so it's really interesting that you would say that, because that actually was one of the ways that I learned to see the world, was just kind of, looking through a rectangular box at Ripon, Wisconsin.
I didn't know if people really did that, or if that was just in movies that they did that, but that's fun.
Yeah, maybe it was just Olympia's thing. I don't know. I've never done it before or after, but it definitely was something has stuck with me to this day.
Yeah. Hey, you have some of the best photo equipment available to humans, and yet you use a cell phone a lot of the time. Can you talk about why and how that developed?
Yeah, so I'll show you here. Here's one of my professional cameras, which is the big Canon 1DX, and this is the one I use most of the time. The iPhone. And the thing is I think I started photography in 1987, and I was really into photojournalism for decades. And then 2010, I was taking a trip to Washington, D.C. with my daughter, Betsy, and we were going to go visit some colleges in the area. And at the time, I worked for the Chicago Tribune, and we were issued company Blackberries, and Blackberries had totally, just the worst cameras on them. And at that point, people were starting to do mobile photography with their cameras, with their phones. And so my daughter had an iPhone, of course, which I had bought for her. And I was like, hey, let me use that when we're on this trip to DC. And so I downloaded this app called Hipstamatic, which creates square images. You could put different filters on it. It's not, you don't really control it. It's just you kind of push a button on the back. I'll actually bring up the app here because I still use it to this day, 10, 11 years later. So it's, it's called Hipstamatic here. It's kind of a fake little like camera. And, over here you have this yellow button and that's it. You take a photo. And so since I had been controlling the scene and setting the exposure, setting the shutter speed, setting the f-stops for years and years and years, to be able to just walk down the street, push a button and have a photo come out somehow was just like a relief to me. And the cool thing about the Hipstamatic app is I do a lot of black and white photography with it. And the photos come out beautiful. Like I don't have to do any kind of extra Photoshop work or toning or editing or whatever you want to call it. The photos come out, blacks are black, and got all my props here. So like this is a book that I did called Shooting from the Hip, which is all Hipstamatic photos. Now most photo books you would have to go and bring the photos in to Photoshop and maybe lighten and darken or do something. Every single one of these, there was actually no work done. This is exactly how they came out of my phone. And that, for me was something, because the iPhone for me simplifies my photography. It allows me to do the things I have to do for my real job, but in my kind of hobby, my photo hobby for my photo career, I don't have to do. And and another whole side to that is, as a newspaper photographer, when I walk into a room and I have my two big cameras and I get up to front and I start shooting, everyone knows I'm some sort of professional, and that'll change people's behavior. They'll act differently. And I know that I'm kind of changing reality just by photographing them. And the thing about walking down the street, shooting from the hip, kind of stealing moments as I walk, some people might think it's creepy or wrong, like, that you shouldn't photograph people without them knowing it. But for me, it's the purest form of photography I can do, because people don't know they're being photographed, they're in public, but, I'm able to capture moments that I think are real. And this is what people look like when they don't know they're being photographed. And that's something that I think I gravitated towards and really enjoyed in street photography, is that I'm making real moments. And then also another part of it too is, as a newspaper photographer, I'm constantly getting names and I'm getting quotes and for the captions and things like that. And with street photography, I can just make a photo and people can fill in their own captions. They can fill in their own ideas of what the image is about. And I don't have to tell them what the image is. They can kind of figure out what it is on their own.
So again, with our audience for this, it's people who aren't used to shooting pictures of people they don't know. So you wouldn't wander into someone's backyard and shoot without letting them know, but you're doing this in public places, on a street.
Yeah, I've always worked in cities that had their headquarters right in the middle of downtown. I worked for the Chicago Tribune, which, at the time we were in the Tribune Tower right on Michigan Avenue, and the San Francisco Chronicles at 5th and Mission, which is kind of near Market Street, which is the major kind of thoroughfare in the retail area. So I've always been able to kind of be out. But I've done, street photography in, Peoria, Illinois, where there's like 5 people on the street, and, it's a little bit of a challenge and you kind of stick out a little bit more. But yeah, it's like I'm not looking through people's windows or trying to, take any cheap shots. There've been plenty of scenes I've seen on the streets that make people look bad, and I don't photograph those. I tend to not photograph the homeless because I feel you have to engage with a homeless person before you start documenting them. It's just unfair to kind of create them, to treat them as just some sort of photo element. But, just a businessman, or just, even if it's just a family walking down the street on a Sunday afternoon, I think that, people might say, don't photograph my children. It's a difficult ethical quandary. But for me, for street photography, it celebrates life, and I don't, try to circulate any photos that people would have a problem with. But they're like, I guarantee you 99% of the people in my book have no idea they're in this book. And, I don't know, out of that many, how many, if they knew they were in that book, would be upset? I don't know, 10, 20, 30% maybe. But I've had a handful of people, kind of know that I photographed them on the street and kind of approach me and say, what did you just take my photo? And then I just try to explain to them what I'm doing. And, and if they want me to delete the photo, I'll delete the photo, which I've done many times. But yeah, it is kind of a, you're walking a tightrope of, especially in today's environment of people being very protective. And so it is, it's not, it's, I like it. I think it's interesting, but, I totally understand if other people find it as not the best way to do photography. But I think you can take some of those ideas that you use in street photography, and use them after you introduce yourself to someone or ask to be photographed. I tend to, in photographic settings, get as low as I can. I like shooting while I'm kneeling or sitting or being underneath someone. It makes them look more heroic, and also makes them feel a lot more comfortable when you're not towering over them or you're right in the face with the camera. And I also think it makes the backgrounds nicer. I think that the worst way you can photograph someone is standing up, 5 feet away, because it's just the backgrounds usually are really junky. You'll get a tree coming out of someone's head, or, just so much information, because a lot of the iPhone cameras or the, whatever, the mobile camera phones, they have very, deep depth of field, so you're getting a lot in focus. Where my professional cameras, I'm shooting at f2.8 usually all the time, which is a very shallow depth of field. So the person I'm photographing is in focus and the background is out of focus, so that the thing that I'm concentrating on really pops out and your eye goes right to it. But when you're shooting with the iPhone and everything is in focus, then you really have to be careful to kind of eliminate things in focus that you don't want to highlight. And that's where I think getting down low or finding a high angle is really pleasing and interesting, and also makes the photographs much, much more interesting to look at.
There's something too, I think, to just not showing people what they are going to see themselves. There's that idea that a photographer sees the world a little differently than everybody else. So even just finding an angle,
right,
something that changes it up a little bit is so interesting.
Yeah, or just putting something in the foreground, just kind of just having, just when I have to shoot a boring building, at least we'll try to put like a tree branch in it or something, just something to give it an extra layer of information. Because that, when I started out in the 1980s, the photojournalistic style was just to have one layer of information, and people would literally go in the dark room and they would blacken down the background. You would have a person and maybe there was a house or a car in the background, and photographers would just make it as dark as they could, and you just have this totally black background. And now ethically we can't get away with that anymore because we're changing reality, but also the current style in photojournalism is to have layers of information. Photographers are shooting very wide, they're stepping back, where I was trained to get as close. If your photos aren't good enough, you're not close enough, type of thing. But now the kind of style in photography is to get way back and to have the scene be really big and the people really small. So it's really interesting over the years, kind of what has been the style has evolved. But I still believe if you're a photographer with not a lot of experience, it's still better to kind of fill the frame when you're shooting it. Don't rely on cropping it later. Just try to get as close as you can, get as many interesting things in there. And there's I'm not a big, I was never, I'm, trained to be a photographer, so I don't know all the concepts, but I know rule of thirds, which is, you take the frame and you split it into 3 sections, and you want to have the interesting things not right in the middle, but just kind of off to the side a little bit. And, but there's all kinds of theories about photography, which I don't really know about, because, at the end, I just call myself a, button pushing monkey, because that's what I feel my photography. And, for me, it's just, it's more of an emotional kind of transaction instead of, a technical one, because I don't, I like getting a camera. I like learning it, learning how to use it, and then never having to think about the technical aspects of it. And, I think the same thing as if you have an iPhone, and you can use the iPhone, just the regular iPhone camera, which is really high quality. But if you want to go into an app or something, like I just have always used Hipstamatic, but I brought up a couple other ones today. I just did some research. There's one that's called Snapseed. I think these are all good. I've just kind of heard of them. And, Pro Camera. I think there's another one. What's it called? Camera Plus 2. Like those are ones that have, you can set shutter speeds and all the things you could do with a professional camera. But I recommend you finding one kind of way you want to photograph and stick with that and just learn that. Don't have 7 different apps that you're using going back and forth. Just find what you like. Like, I've been shooting Hipstamatic for so long, they actually named a lens after me because I've given them so much publicity. So so I just think it's better to kind of learn. One is the smallest amount of technical things you need to learn to make good photographs, and then leave it at that. There's really no need to be doing everything if you don't have the time to do it. Just kind of keep it simple, stupid.
Do you use any of the add-on lenses, or do you just use the lens that's on the camera itself?
Yeah, just the one that's on the camera. And but because once again, if I want to shoot a telephoto lens or something, I'll just use one of my big cameras. I kind of consider my iPhone like my sketch pad. If I was an artist, I'm just doodling on a napkin, and it's very ephemeral. It's not meant to be something that lasts forever, even though I've turned into a book. But for me, it's just something that while I'm walking down the street on a hike and I see something interesting, I'll make a photo and I'll put it on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. There's those are my 3 main places where I share photographs. So in Instagram now too, you can just kind of shoot through Instagram. They have different filters if you want, so they're all pretty high quality. Like the iPhone, if you have a 10 or an 11 or whatever, the best ones are now, you have almost a professional camera in your pocket. It's it's not really necessary to spend money on something else.
You mentioned one advantage of carrying a phone camera, and that's being inconspicuous. Are there other advantages that you find that people might not be aware of, that this is actually a little better than carrying a DSLR sometimes?
Well, one of the things I like is, the lens is so small that a lot of times, if you want to, like, say, shoot through a fence, you can just kind of put the lens in between the fence, and it doesn't look like you're shooting through a fence, or, and you can kind of, get the lens like right on the ground. And so if you want to shoot something really low, you can kind of, get it, just right at ground level, because I really enjoy sometimes shooting at ground level. So just kind of the mobility of it and having it small. But I do think that the number one thing is when you walk down the street, especially in a tourist area, everyone is photographing with their phone. So you don't really stand out, and you can kind of move into a moment, and people won't even notice that you're photographing a scene. And once again too, if you're photographing people who are maybe nervous of you, sometimes it's better not to have a big pile of equipment. And because when I get my big cameras, people always assume somehow I'm going to take their photograph and I'm going to make $1 million off of it. That's like, people always say that to me. Oh, you're going to make $1 million off of that photo. Give me some of that money. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't think I'm going to, but if I do, I will give you half of it for sure.
Here's 20 cents, huh?
Exactly.
Let's see, I was thinking about limitations. Do you see people doing things with their cell phone cameras that are making their photos weaker, like forgetting to to touch on the screen where you want it to focus or things like that.
Yeah. I think one of the problems is, don't rely on the camera's flash to do anything. That's something I'll see a lot of times. People, 50 feet away from something at night, and then they, you know, well, night is a whole nother issue, but even, just the flash is only going to work if something is like 2 to 3 feet away. But the cameras now, you can shoot at very low light. So, I have a tiny little iPhone tripod that I will use maybe once or twice a year. But most of the time, if you just kind of make a tripod with your arms, and just kind of hold it steady, or find something to set your camera upon and then very gently, push the shutter, the camera will adjust for it. So I think, going with available light for me is always interesting, and I think find the most, the best quality of light. Also, it seems to be people tend to be afraid to shoot into the sun. People always want to have the sun at their back. I find backlit photos 100 times more interesting than front lit photos. So don't be afraid, to photograph, into the sun, especially if you're photographing a person, because if you put them with the sun in their face, they're going to be squinting, and it's just not a very appealing type of light. So, just try to find some open shade, or, even just kind of, put their back to the sun, and kind of work it that way. I really love backlighting. I think it's one of the least, kind of style of photography that non-professionals don't take advantage of it. That was the worst sentence ever. But anyways, I hope you know what I was saying.
We'll edit you.
Thank you. Rearrange my words.
Yeah. Let's see. So I was thinking about something else with motion. Like if you're trying to shoot sports or something, I've noticed phone cameras don't do very well.
Yeah, no, there are definite limitations. There are things that, even during the day, sometimes when I'm walking down the street, I'll get a lot of motion blur in the images, and sometimes that's to your advantage. Sometimes it'll work out, but most of the time it's not. So, it definitely is best when, you have a lot of light, or, you're close enough to kind of concentrate on one person. But yeah, I wouldn't take it to a football game. And you could take it and photograph sidelines, a lot of nice images of the players sitting on the sidelines or things like that. But if you're trying to capture action, that's really difficult. And it's even difficult if you start getting into professional gear. You really have to kind of buy really expensive lenses in order to stop the action. And so yes, but there's, I could probably do 90% of my job with an iPhone. It's just the 10% that I will never be able to do.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about the way you shoot photos where people are not camera aware. Do you have any guidelines for when and when not to have your subjects be camera aware? And then if they are, anything where they're not just posing like a bad snapshot?
Yeah, it's almost always after that you realize which one is the right one. When I do my street photography, every once in a while, I'll post something called an accidental portrait, where I'll be just walking by someone and they just, for some reason, happen to be looking right at my lens or at my phone. And it looks like I posed them there, even though they didn't even really know they were being photographed. And sometimes I find those really compelling. But at other times, I feel like I have this amazing scene and there's so much great going on, and there'll be one person staring right at the camera, and it just ruins it all because it kind of takes away, whatever spontaneity there was. So, you're kind of at the, at the mercy of what happens. But, one way as a professional photographer around that is we shoot a lot of frames. Like I will, back in the film days, if I made 300 photos on an assignment, that was a lot. Now, I'll shoot a professional football game and I might shoot 5,000 frames. It's just because it's all digital and it all fits on one card. And so when I'm in a situation a news situation where there's a lot of people, there'll always be a couple frames where just someone's looking at the camera or they're blinking or something like that. But, I have so many frames to choose from that I'll usually find at least one that everything kind of works for me. So, don't be afraid to, take a lot of photographs. And I think one of the issues too with people who use the iPhone or whatever mobile camera is they forget to download the images off their phone, and they just store them on their phone, and then their phone kind of melts down, and then they lose all their photographs. So I think it's important to somehow either, send your photos up to the cloud, or just use an external hard drive, or, download them onto your laptop. Just make sure that you have your images backed up, because you just can't rely on your phone keeping them forever. That's really, I think, one of the more important things is just always be, having your photos in more than one place. And if you could have them in 3 or 4 different places, that's even better.
I have a little thing on my desk that looks like this, but I plug that into my phone, and it's just a flash drive that you can grab photos off your phone without having to connect to a laptop or something. So little things like that can even help, I know.
Perfect.
If you're out somewhere. I've noticed in some of your shooting that you'll just zero in on somebody's hands, or you'll zero in on something inanimate sometimes. But talk about that a little bit too, about maybe going beyond the obvious and thinking of different focal lengths and ranges.
Yeah. Back when we would do photo stories that were in the newspaper that weren't slideshows online, you did not want every photo to be composed and shot the same exact way. You cannot have 6 wide angle photos with the person 10 feet away and make that any interesting sort of edit in a a book or a newspaper. And so we would be taught to do details, which would be just kind of like you said, someone's hands in prayer, or just a very close shot of someone's face, or just some interesting metal on their uniform or something, just something that can run small, but it's big enough to be of interest. And, when we would lay out our photographs, we would make sure that in each photograph, the person's head size was a different size. So, you would want some photographs where their head takes up most of the frame, and somewhere it's really small, and somewhere it's in the middle. And if you kind of had all the same sized head, it just would not work. And even though we're not doing a lot of newspaper stories anymore, I still think it works when you have something just on a slideshow online just on a slideshow. But yeah, it's like visual variety is really important. And as a professional photographer, we have zoom lenses, or we have different focal lengths. But with your iPhone, you're going to have to be the zoom lens. You're going to have to, move around and get closer, and move back and get up and down and things like that. And so I think that's really important. And like I mentioned before, I can't say it enough. Do not rely on cropping, because it really is really difficult. But if you have to crop an image, one of my recommendation is whatever ratio the original photo is in, try to crop the photo at the same ratio. So you fool the viewer into thinking that you actually photographed it that way. And so say your normal ratio is 2:3. Make sure you crop it 2:3, just to make sure that you kind of have that same look and feel to it. Like my hip schematics, they're all square. So everything is square. So it's, if I cropped it non-square, it would look really, really strange. But, every photo in my Shooting from the Hip book is full frame. None of them are cropped. They're all, exactly how I shot them. And that's kind of my goal as a professional photographer, is never have to crop an image. But when you're shooting sports or spot news or something where you're not controlling the scene, obviously you're going to have to crop. But when you're shooting portraits or something and you can control every bit of the shoot, then just try to fill the frame with everything you want in there, and not worry about it later.
And while we're on that subject, how about zooming? I know with cell phones, that's kind of a no-no, right? Because you lose a lot of resolution.
Yeah, so basically when you zoom on a cell phone, you're basically just cropping, the wide angle image. And if it was a 4 megabyte file, you might be getting it down to a 2 megabyte file, just immediately just by cropping it. And but once again, I never, I would say never, but I very rarely zoom in with my actual camera. But I think yeah, the top line iPhones, it's a little bit better, but I think most people probably don't have top line iPhones. But but that's a good advice too. Just
Sorry, some have the multiple lenses, I know too, where it's got a telephoto and a wide and a regular, you see
right,
more phones with 3 lenses on them now or something.
right. And also another thing that I find interesting, and this works better on the older iPhones, is a lot of times when you're shooting it to the light, like I was talking about before, the camera will automatically kind of expose for the brightest thing. So you'll end up with just a silhouette of someone standing there. But what I would do is I would kind of frame up my scene, and I would hold my hand over the lens to kind of fool it into thinking it was darker. And then I would take it off and I would shoot the photo as quick as I could. And then that would kind of, almost kind of setting your own exposure. Now, the new iPhones are so fast with their automatic exposure that it's really hard to even trick them. But some of the older iPhones, like the 6s, 5, 6, 7s, whatever, I would a lot of times just kind of put my hand over the lens and take it off, and I could kind of control the exposure just kind of in this old-fashioned manual way.
That's funny. So you can't move your hands that fast anymore.
Right? No, the cameras are just too fast.
This is super helpful, Scott. Thank you. I think maybe the last thing I'd ask you is, I've seen you talk about this before, heard you talk about this, but not being a perfectionist and not feeling like every photo you take, if it's not the best thing you've ever shot, no one should see it. How do you get past that sort of a mindset when you're new at this and don't want to embarrass yourself?
No, like I was mortified when I first started out, because I worked at a newspaper that had 2 offices. And when we would shoot color slide film, we would have to send it up to the other office and have it developed up there. And someone would edit the photos, and I never would get to see them. And it was just like, oh my gosh, they're seeing all my bad photos and things like that. But you just have to realize that, I'm a professional photographer. Like you mentioned, I've won plenty of awards. And if you looked at my, a take from one assignment, you'll see plenty of bad photos, and out of focus and just poorly exposed or bad composition. And, it's just that you have to kind of, it's a process. It's like, they always say you find your keys in the last place you look. Well, a lot of times, your best photos are after this long journey of, okay, I'm trying this, I'm going to try that. I'm going to try really slow shutter speed. No, that didn't work. Okay, I'm going to try this. And, oh, that's it. I found it. This is what works best. And, and just kind of, consider those mistakes and those images that don't work. It's just part of the journey and not as some endpoint. And as long as, you get there to the end and you get one good photo out of a situation, that's really all you need. And so I wouldn't, even though it is, when you create something and you show it to someone else and they don't like it, it's just like being stabbed in the heart. But you kind of have to get over that. And I'm not saying I still have at this point, but it's definitely something that I understand, and you shouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, it's interesting too that I think the older we are, the more we still default to that film mindset, to think, oh, I can only shoot a couple of pictures because I don't want to waste it all. And
yeah.
Shooting 5,000 at a football game. So.
Yeah. You just have to make sure you have time to edit them all.
Yeah. Are you editing those 5,000? Somebody else?
Well, the good thing about a football game is I know, like, I'll first go to, okay, I know that, the 49ers scored a touchdown in the first quarter. I'm going to go there first. And then there was a big interception in the third quarter. I'm going to go look at those photos. And on the professional cameras, you're able to look at a photo and tag it. And so then when I get back and I download all my images, I go right to the tagged ones first. So, I take that 5,000 photos down to about 50 photos immediately. And then I do those, and then I kind of look around, where those good photos are. I'll guarantee you that I've shot some football games and I haven't looked at all the photographs I've made. I've probably only looked at 60% of the images I made, because I know that this play, there's no significance to it at all. So there's no point even sending one. So you know, but that's, you know, the professional sporting event where you have the motor drives that are going at 10 frames a second. You know, it's kind of hard to avoid shooting a lot of frames now.
Yeah. Anything we didn't talk about in regard to smartphone photography that you wanted to bring up? I think.
No, it's like, you know, I just think, you know, have fun with it and practice it a lot, because you can do it around the house with your cat, you know, with the light streaming in a window, just, you know, whatever. It's, you always have it in your pocket. So when you're on a walk, you know, bring it out and you know, give yourself assignments. Say, okay, I'm going to go take a walk today and I'm going to try to find 5 interesting things, or today I'm going to do 5 detail shots, just really close things. You're just kind of self-assign things and pretend you're out on an assignment. And, you know, like I said, you're not, it doesn't cost you anything except for a little bit of time. So I think that's probably the best thing. But once again, you know, I'm not a technical photographer. I don't, you know, I just kind of, you know, learned by doing it. And I think that is by far the thing to do. And the more you photograph, the better you're going to get at it. And you might, you know, actually, you know, decide to do it, you know, professionally. That would be fun.